The vet didn't hesitate. He barely glanced at the chart before speaking. "There's nothing more we can do." The words landed heavier than he expected, not because he hadn't prepared himself for them, but because of how final they sounded. No pause, no uncertainty, just a conclusion delivered with professional calm, the kind of tone people use when they've already accepted the ending and moved on. The horse stood quietly in the stall, head lowered, breathing shallow but steady. It didn't look dramatic. It wasn't thrashing or crying out in pain. That almost made it worse. Pain at least demands attention. This looked like resignation, like a body slowly giving up without protest. The vet continued explaining, pointing out complications, risks, odds that no longer mattered, infections, internal damage, quality of life. Each word was reasonable, logical, impossible to argue with on paper, but standing there, listening, he felt something tighten in his chest that logic couldn't reach. "So what are you saying?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. The vet met his eyes this time. Putting him down would be the humane option. Humane. The word echoed longer than it should have. It sounded kind, responsible. It sounded like the right thing to say. Everyone in the room nodded almost automatically, as if the decision had already been made somewhere beyond discussion. This was the moment people usually accept, the moment when resistance feels selfish. He looked back at the horse. Its ears flicked slightly at the sound of voices, not alert, not afraid, just aware enough to know people were deciding something important without asking it. He remembered how the horse had been earlier that morning, how it had struggled just to lift its head, how everyone had said it wouldn't last the night, and yet, here it was, still breathing, still present, still holding on in a way that didn't fit the story being told about it. "I need a minute," he said quietly. The vet nodded, stepping back without argument. They had seen this reaction before: shock, denial. People often needed time before agreeing to the inevitable. This, they assumed, was that moment. He stepped closer to the stall, resting a hand against the wooden frame. The horse shifted slightly, sensing him, its eye opening just enough to acknowledge the movement. There was no spark of strength there, no sudden sign of recovery, but there was something else, something unfinished. He swallowed hard. This wasn't about refusing reality. It wasn't about miracles or false hope. It was about whether nothing more we can do was actually true, or just the easiest thing to say. He turned back toward the vet. "No," he said. The room went quiet. The word hung in the air longer than he expected. No one spoke right away. No wasn't something they heard often in rooms like this. Not after charts were reviewed. Not after options were explained. Certainly not after the word humane had been used. People usually nodded at that point. They thanked the vet. They looked away. The vet studied him for a moment, not annoyed, not surprised, just cautious. Experience had taught them what resistance usually meant. It meant pain stretched out longer than necessary. It meant false hope. It meant endings that arrived anyway, just later and harder. They had seen it too many times. "I understand how difficult this is," the vet said carefully, "but prolonging this won't change the outcome." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stayed where he was, close to the stall, listening to the horse's breathing, still shallow, still uneven, but there. That mattered more than probabilities and percentages ever could. "I'm not asking for guarantees," he said finally. His voice was steady, surprising even himself. "I'm asking for time." Time, the simplest request, and somehow the most unreasonable one. The vet exhaled slowly. "There's a point where treatment becomes suffering," they said. "We have to think about what's best for him." He nodded. He had expected that, expected the ethics, the responsibility, the weight of professional judgment. None of it was wrong. That was the problem. Every argument made sense except for the one pounding quietly in his chest. He stepped closer to the horse now, resting his hand gently against its neck. The skin was warm, the muscle beneath it weak but responsive. The horse shifted slightly, leaning into the contact just enough to notice it. Not pain, not fear, connection. "If he was ready to go," he said softly, almost to himself, he wouldn't still be fighting this hard. The room stayed quiet again, not tense, just uncertain. Everyone was waiting to see if emotion would take over next. Trying meant starting from almost nothing. No shortcuts, no promises, just a fragile plan built around the idea that survival was still possible, even if unlikely. The vet outlined the steps carefully, their tone shifting from finality to caution. Medication, monitoring, limited movement, constant reassessment. Each instruction came with an unspoken reminder this could still end badly. He listened without interrupting, absorbing every word. This wasn't victory, it was responsibility, the kind that settles heavily when you realize you've asked someone to take a risk they didn't believe in. If this failed, it wouldn't just be the horse that paid the price. The weight of the decision would stay with him long after. They began immediately. The stall filled with quiet activity, gloved hands, measured movements, tools placed gently out of the horse's line of sight. The horse reacted weakly at first, flinching slightly at unfamiliar sensations. He stayed close, speaking softly, not to calm it with words but with presence. That part at least he knew how to do. Minutes stretched, then more. The vet checked vitals again and again, searching for signs that the effort wasn't in vain. Breathing remained shallow, but steadier than before. The horse's eye followed movement in the stall, dull but alert, not a sign of recovery, but not the blankness of surrender either. Don't read too much into small changes, the vet cautioned. Sometimes they don't mean what we want them to mean. He nodded. He wasn't chasing hope anymore. Hope had a way of distorting reality. What he was watching for now was something quieter. Resistance, the refusal to let go, that he believed mattered more. As the hours passed, exhaustion crept in around the edges. The adrenaline that had fueled his defiance began to fade, replaced by doubt. What if they were right? What if this only delayed the inevitable? He pushed the thought away, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't useful yet. The horse shifted slightly, testing its weight, a small movement, barely noticeable, but intentional. The vet paused, watching closely. So did he. They exchanged a brief look. No excitement, no relief, just acknowledgement. That's something, the vet said quietly. It wasn't much, it wasn't enough, but it was something no one had expected when the day began. He exhaled slowly, feeling tension ease just a fraction. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about staying honest with what was happening in front of him, and what was happening against expectation was that the horse was still here, still fighting, still answering. Night came again, quietly and without ceremony. Not the dramatic kind that signals endings, but the slow, unavoidable return of uncertainty. The barn lights were dimmed, machines hummed softly, and the activity of the day gave way to waiting. This was the part no one ever talked about, the hours where nothing happens until suddenly something does. He stayed, not because anyone asked him to, but because leaving felt wrong. The horse lay still, breathing shallow but consistent, every rise of its chest, something he counted without realizing it. The vet had warned him not to read meaning into every breath, every twitch, but that was easier said than done when time stretched and silence filled the space between sounds. The medication began to take effect slowly, not dramatically, just enough to ease the strain. The horse's breathing evened out, no longer racing toward collapse, no longer fighting for each inhale. The vet checked vitals again, making notes without commentary. Professionals didn't celebrate early, they waited for proof. Fatigue pressed down hard now. His body ached from standing, sitting, standing again. Sleep tugged at him in brief, unwanted waves. He closed his eyes once, just for a second, and imagined what it would feel like to wake up and find the stall empty. The thought snapped him fully awake. Not yet, he told himself, not yet. The horse shifted slightly in the darkness. A quiet sound escaped its throat, not pain, not distress, awareness. He leaned forward instinctively, careful not to startle it. Its eye opened briefly, catching the faint reflection of the light. There was no strength there, but there was recognition. That mattered more than he was ready to admit. The vet returned later, footsteps soft on the concrete floor. They stood together for a moment without speaking, both watching the same fragile rhythm. This is usually where things go one way or the other, the vet said quietly. No warning. He nodded. He had expected that too. There were no guarantees waiting on the other side of the night, only the outcome of a decision already made. Trying meant accepting whatever came next. As the hours passed, the horse held steady. No improvement, but no collapse either. In a situation built on extremes, stability felt almost unreal. The vet made another note, then another. Nothing remarkable, nothing final, but as the night wore on, one truth became impossible to ignore. The horse wasn't slipping away, it was holding its ground. Morning didn't arrive with relief. It came quietly, almost cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome yet. The light filtering through the windows revealed the same stall, the same fragile body on the ground, the same unanswered question hanging in the air. Nothing had resolved itself overnight, but nothing had ended either. The vet checked the horse again, movements calm, expression neutral, vitals were taken, notes were made. The routine continued as if this were an ordinary case, even though everyone in the room knew it wasn't. Ordinary cases didn't start with the words "put him down." They didn't carry this kind of weight. The horse responded slowly when examined. A slight movement of the leg, a flicker of the ear, small things easily dismissed. Except now, no one was dismissing anything. The vet paused longer than before, watching, reassessing. The certainty that had filled the room the day before was gone, replaced by something more cautious. He's still critical, the vet said. The words were deliberate, honest. But he's stable. Stable. The word landed differently than humane. It didn't promise recovery, it didn't erase risk, but it meant the fight hadn't been lost overnight. It meant the decision to try hadn't been reckless, at least not yet. He exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. This wasn't a victory, it was permission to keep going, and sometimes that's all survival needs. They adjusted the treatment plan, making small changes based on what the night had revealed. Dosages were refined, movement was limited further, everything was done with restraint, as if pushing too hard might tip the balance in the wrong direction. The vet explained each step, no longer speaking as if the end were inevitable, but as if the outcome was still being written. He stayed close, listening, watching, learning. This wasn't his world, he knew that, but it had become his responsibility. Every decision now carried the echo of the one he had made earlier. Refusing hadn't ended the story, it had complicated it. The horse lifted its head slightly later that morning, holding it up longer than before. Not a dramatic moment. No one reached for cameras, but the vet noticed. So did he. They exchanged a look that didn't need words. That's new, the vet said quietly. He didn't smile. Not yet. Hope was still fragile, still dangerous, but something inside him settled just enough to breathe easier. Against expectation, against probability, the horse was still choosing to stay, and for now, that was enough. The next hours tested patience more than fear ever had. There was no dramatic shift, no clear sign that things were turning in one direction or the other. Just observation, waiting, and the constant awareness that one wrong move could undo everything they had gained. The vet explained that this stage was often the most deceptive. Animals could appear stable right before declining again, or they could surprise everyone by slowly reclaiming strength when no one expected it. Experience offered patterns, not promises, and right now, the pattern wasn't clear. They decided to help the horse change position, not to stand far too early for that, but enough to relieve pressure and encourage circulation. The preparation was careful, deliberate, every hand movement measured, every reaction monitored. The horse resisted weakly at first, not in panic but in confusion. Then it settled, breathing heavy but controlled. He stayed close, speaking softly, not words meant to inspire but sounds meant to ground. The horse responded in the smallest ways, ears flicking, head shifting, eyes tracking movement, signs that it was present, engaged, not drifting away. This is where we usually see the truth, the vet said quietly, whether the body can start helping us back. They waited. Minutes passed, then more. The horse's breathing steadied again after the movement. No spike, No crash. The vet checked vitals, then checked them again. The numbers weren't impressive, but they were consistent, and consistency at this stage was everything. He leaned against the stall wall, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Not the physical kind, he had pushed past that long ago, but the mental weight of holding a decision that could still go wrong. If this ended badly, he knew exactly what people would say. They would say he should have listened, that he had delayed the inevitable, that refusing had been selfish. He accepted that possibility. He had accepted it the moment he said no. The horse shifted again, this time more deliberately, a leg tucked slightly under its body, testing weight, not standing, not close, but adjusting, choosing comfort over collapse. The vet noticed immediately, kneeling closer to observe. That's intentional, they said, not excitement, just fact. He felt something tighten behind his eyes and forced himself to breathe. This wasn't the moment to assign meaning too quickly, but it was the first time since the word humane had been spoken that the future felt open. The vet stood slowly. We're not out of danger, they said, but this isn't ending today. He nodded once, absorbing the words fully. Refusing hadn't solved anything, it had only bought time, but time, it turned out, was exactly what the horse needed most. The day unfolded slowly, almost cautiously, as if no one wanted to rush whatever fragile progress had been made. The barn no longer felt like a place waiting for an ending. It felt like a place holding its breath. Every sound seemed amplified now, the rustle of hay, the soft hum of equipment, the quiet footsteps of the staff moving in and out with practiced restraint. The horse remained on the ground, but its posture had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would impress anyone walking in for the first time, but to those who had been there from the beginning, the difference was unmistakable. The body no longer looked like it was surrendering to gravity, it looked like it was negotiating with it. The vet explained that this stage was critical. Too much intervention could overwhelm the body, too little could allow weakness to win back ground. They adjusted the plan again, fine-tuning rather than changing direction. That alone spoke volumes. No one fine-tunes a plan they expect to fail. He listened closely, asking questions now, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. What signs mattered, what changes would raise concern, what to expect if the horse tried to stand too soon. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer about endings, it was about managing possibility. Later that afternoon, the horse attempted to lift its chest off the ground. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't strong, just a slow, trembling effort that lasted only a few seconds before it settled back down. The stall went completely still. No one spoke, no one moved. The vet knelt immediately, checking the response, watching closely for stress. The horse's breathing increased briefly, then stabilized. No panic, no collapse, just effort followed by rest. Exactly what they wanted to see. That's not instinct, the vet said quietly. That's intent. The word lingered. Intent meant choice. It meant the horse wasn't simply reacting anymore, it was participating. He felt the weight in his chest shift, not lift, not disappear, but change shape. This wasn't hope rushing in, it was recognition. Recognition that the decision to refuse had opened a door that hadn't existed before. What waited beyond it was still uncertain, but at least now, there was something on the other side. As evening approached again, plans were made for the night. More monitoring, more patience, no shortcuts. The vet made it clear that the next attempt to stand, whenever it came, would have to be supported. The risk was still real. Failure was still possible. Nothing about this was guaranteed. He stayed until the lights dimmed, until the space settled back into quiet. He stood by the stall one last time, resting a hand against the wood, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing that had once seemed so fragile, still weak, still fighting. This wasn't the moment he had imagined when he first said no. There was no clarity, no certainty, just the understanding that the story had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Tomorrow would ask a harder question, and for the first time, he believed there might be an answer. The next morning brought a different kind of tension. Not the fear that something might end suddenly, but the pressure of what might begin. The horse had made it through another night. That alone would have seemed impossible just days earlier. But surviving and recovering were two very different things, and everyone in the barn understood that now. The equipment was prepared quietly, straps laid out, supports checked twice, nothing rushed. Today wasn't about forcing progress, it was about discovering whether progress was possible at all. The vet explained each step again, carefully, as if repetition itself could reduce the risk. This is only an attempt, they said. If he resists, we stop. If he struggles, we stop. If anything feels wrong, we stop. He nodded. Stopping was no longer a failure, it was part of the agreement they had made with uncertainty. The horse reacted as the supports were gently positioned, not with panic, with awareness. Its muscles tensed, not in fear, but in effort. That distinction mattered more than anyone said out loud. The vet watched closely, one hand ready to signal an immediate halt. They lifted slowly, just enough to shift weight, just enough to ask the question. The horse's legs trembled under the unfamiliar demand, hooves searching for balance that had been absent for too long. The stall felt impossibly quiet, every breath suddenly too loud. For a moment it seemed like too much. The horse leaned into the support, head lowered, body shaking. He felt his chest tighten again, the old fear returning uninvited. This was the risk they had accepted. This was the moment refusing had led to. Then the horse adjusted, not standing, not yet, but correcting its position, placing weight more deliberately, finding something solid where moments earlier there had been nothing. The vet's expression changed, not relief, not excitement, but focus sharpened by surprise. Hold, they said softly. They waited. Seconds stretched. The horse breathed hard, then steadied, still supported, still fragile, but upright enough to matter, enough to prove that the body remembered something the mind hadn't dared to trust yet. They lowered him carefully after, ending the attempt before fatigue could steal the ground they had gained. No applause followed, no celebration, just quiet acknowledgement among those who understood what they had just witnessed. That was enough for today, the vet said, and for the first time, enough didn't sound like defeat. He stepped back, hands shaking slightly now that adrenaline had nowhere else to go. This wasn't recovery. It wasn't even progress in the way people like to define it, but it was proof that the word no hadn't been spoken into emptiness. The horse rested again, exhausted but present. The barn returned to its quiet rhythm, but nothing about the situation felt the same anymore. They were no longer asking if, they were asking how far. The hours after the attempt felt heavier than the attempt itself. Success, if it could even be called that, had introduced a new kind of pressure. Before, the question had been whether the horse would survive. Now it was whether survival could turn into something more. Progress, once imagined, demands answers that patience alone can't give. The vet was careful not to let optimism move faster than reality. What they had seen mattered, yes, but it also raised new risks. Standing, even briefly, changed the equation. Muscles that hadn't carried weight in days would ache. Circulation would fluctuate. Fatigue could undo fragile gains if pushed too far. Everything now required restraint. They adjusted the plan again. Shorter attempts, longer rest, more observation, the kind of fine detail that only appears when a case is no longer considered lost. No one said it out loud, but the shift was obvious. This was no longer an exception they were managing. It was a recovery they were cautiously preparing for. He stayed close, quieter than before. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to refuse. The hardest decision had already been made, and it had opened the door to 1,000 smaller ones. Each carried weight, each required judgment without certainty. This, he realized, was the true cost of saying no. The horse rested through the afternoon, exhaustion written clearly in every slow breath. But there was a difference now. The body no longer lay as if it belonged to the floor. It shifted occasionally, adjusting position, testing comfort, small acts of agency that hadn't existed before, signs that the body was no longer just enduring, it was responding. Late in the day, the vet returned with a look that was difficult to read, not concern, not reassurance, something between. They stood together at the stall, watching in silence for a moment longer than usual. Tomorrow, the vet said finally, we'll have to decide how far we're willing to go. The words landed quietly, but carried more weight than anything spoken before. Tomorrow wouldn't be about trying, it would be about committing. Another supported stand, longer duration, less margin for error, the kind of step that turns possibility into consequence. He nodded slowly. There was no fear in the gesture, only understanding. He had already crossed the line where comfort lived. Whatever came next would demand the same thing the first refusal had demanded: presence, responsibility, and the willingness to accept the outcome. As night settled in again, he stayed by the stall longer than usual. The barn felt familiar now, no longer a place of crisis but of fragile routine. The horse breathed steadily, eyes half closed, resting deeper than it had since the ordeal began. Still weak, still vulnerable, but no longer drifting. He rested a hand against the stall, not touching, just close enough to be felt. Tomorrow would ask its question plainly. There would be no room left to delay, to wait, or to hope quietly from a distance. Whatever happened next, it would answer everything. The morning arrived without drama. No sudden rush, no urgent voices, just the quiet understanding that this was the day the question would finally be answered. The horse was prepared slowly, every movement familiar now, supports checked, straps secured, hands steady. No one spoke more than necessary. This wasn't about encouragement anymore, it was about respect for the risk, and for the effort already made. He stood close as the vet gave the signal. They lifted carefully, inch by inch, watching for any sign of distress. The horse's legs trembled at first, muscles remembering a weight they hadn't carried in far too long. Breathing quickened. The room went completely still. Then the horse straightened, not perfectly, not confidently, but enough to stand, enough to balance, enough to prove that the body had not forgotten how. Seconds passed, then more. The vet watched closely, ready to stop everything at the first sign of collapse, but it didn't come. The horse adjusted its stance, finding steadiness where none had existed before, shaking, exhausted, alive in a way no one had expected when the word humane was first spoken. That's it, the vet said quietly. We've got him. They lowered the supports moments later, ending the attempt before fatigue could steal the victory. No one cheered, no one celebrated. They didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what had just happened. Later, when the barn had returned to its usual rhythm, he stood alone beside the stall. The horse rested, standing now with assistance, head lowered, breathing slow and steady, not healed, not safe from every risk, but no longer a case marked for ending. He thought back to that first moment, the calm voice, the certainty. There's nothing more we can do. He hadn't argued, he hadn't raised his voice, he had simply said no, not because he knew the outcome, not because he believed in miracles, but because something in front of him wasn't finished yet. Sometimes, survival doesn't come from knowing the right answer, it comes from refusing the easiest one, from staying when walking away would have been simpler, from choosing responsibility over certainty. The vet had been right about one thing: this decision had changed everything, just not in the way anyone expected.